Okay, let's talk about Agile. And it's like the name implies. You need to understand kind of where Agile came from. Before Agile, we had this very highly formalized structured approach called SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle. And with the SDLC, you had a feasibility study and requirements gathering and design and development and testing and implementation, deployment, and post-deployment. And a very rigid version of SDLC was something called waterfall, where you couldn't move to the next stage until you had passed the toll gate, people signed off, we're done. Okay, now you can move to the next stage. Hit a toll gate, you're done. Now the next, and there was no going back. And this way it was very rigid, there was basically no scope creep, and it would take years, possibly. One of the problems with waterfall and SDLC is that by the time we've totally got this done, the customer didn't need it anymore. Or the environment had changed, or it just took so darn long. However, don't knock that. I mean, waterfall got us to the moon. So, I mean, it definitely has its place. It still has its place. But even really large Fortune 100 companies are moving to an Agile development process. So here's what Agile is all about. It's basically developed by these developers who said, you know what, we're going to create sort of like our own philosophy. And they created this Agile manifesto. And the manifesto basically had 4 statements. One is that we will favor individuals and interactions over processes and tools. We will also favor working software over complete documentation. Don't think Agile's not about documentation, but what we favor, working software over documenting every single step. We favor customer collaboration over contract negotiation. One of the things that makes Agile successful is that the customer is there with you all the time, on a daily basis, working with you to make sure that you're always on track. And we favor responding to change over just following a plan. Like I said before, we were working on this one project, and we just could not get the next major release out the door. We couldn't. We had spent a year and a half on it, and it wasn't until we brought in some Agile experts, and they really shook everybody up. I have to admit, it completely rocked everyone's world, the developers. I mean, they were not used to this at all. But once they adopted it, we got that major release out the door and into the field. I'm not saying that it is always the end-all and be-all, but so many organizations are moving towards the Agile process. There are a variety of flavors of Agile, but let me describe what I've seen. So like in Agile, you basically have very clear time-boxed periods of time called sprints, like typically 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks' time, we're only going to get this much done, period. And the developers, they self-organize. It's very sort of democratic. You don't have you do this, you do this. Instead, they together figure out, okay, in this amount of time, we can get these things done. So there's like a stack of things we'd like to get done that the customer wants, specific little features. And they don't even have to be like a complete working product. It's like one thing we want to get done. And you have a stack of these. And the developers sit together and they go, okay, this will take this much effort, this will take this much effort, this will take this much effort. Okay, within 2 weeks' time, we can get this much done. And everything else stays on the stack in what's called a backlog. Backlog isn't a bad term in Agile. It just means the stack of things we want to get done. The nice thing about it is that it really helps manage customer expectation because you get the customer involved all the time. And when the customer is there and is seeing that, and they're involved helping you determine, okay, we've only got so much time, so the customer will choose what's important to them. So the developers can say, we can get these done in the amount of time. Which ones do you want? And the customer says, well, okay, I want this one, that one, that one, that one, and I recognize that's it for 2 weeks. And there's like a term, YAGNI, you ain't gonna need it. See, customers, they come in and they say, I want this and I want that, and everyone's going, oh my goodness. But when you get the customer involved day to day, and they pick their priorities, and that I want this thing ended up staying on the stack and was not part of what we're gonna do, And next time around, the I want this thing stays on the stack. After a while, they say, yeah, you're right, I really don't need it. And they themselves come to the conclusion that these frills that they wanted really are not crucial to the main functionality of this. It's an evolutionary process that involves constant involvement of everybody. And then what you have is the developers, they self-assign, and like you might have like a whiteboard here that shows all the different like days of the week, the 2 weeks along the sprint, and with post-its where each developer is Monday, Tuesday, and we can see how far along we are. And if a developer is done, then we go ahead and we pick up another. They pick up another thing. Sometimes in extreme development, you'll have programmers pair programming, where one guy's doing the main thing and the other guy's kind of checking. And so, and that's a really interesting way, and it's a really effective way as well. And then what will often happen is you'll have somebody called a Scrum Master whose main job is not to lead people, but to basically keep everyone off their back and to make sure that nothing distracts the developers from getting their job done. And so they have a very clear time box time. They get it all done, and then you have Scrum meetings. And to make sure that people aren't lounging around, the meetings go on for 2 hours, you stand. You stand in a circle so that people don't waste any time in the meeting. And they say, where are we, where are we, where are we? So Agile is a very interesting method. Some people might not like Agile because they'll say, well, how do we plan? How do we know? It really is an evolutionary thing in iterative, short iterative steps. And if you're trying to get something done quickly, it's actually a very effective method. On the other hand, if you need to have very clear controls all the way along with clear documentation, like get us to the moon, well then waterfall, the SDLC, also has its place. So two very, very common methods here. But we're seeing movement towards Agile more and more. Now, prototyping is, let me just create something real quick, what I think you might like. Do you like it? This kind of helps the customer evolve what their vision of what this application, this service, this thing should be. And the customer, we might sketch it out, or you know, you might, if we're developing a car, we'll like carve the clay. No, I don't like it. No problem. Let me lump the clay back all up together and let me carve it to look something different, or draw a sketch. So in prototypes, let me just wump something up real quick. Do you like it? What don't you like? Okay, let's do another one with the changes that you want. And we evolve it in prototypes till we get what you want. With rapid application development, with RAD, basically you're using prototypes. And we're favoring prototypes and minimal planning so that we can just get stuff done quicker. We use really skilled teams, and we'll use integrated development tools, and we'll have all of our files and all of our code in a central location. There are plenty of tools where you can have like SVN repositories or Team Foundation servers where people check in and check out code. And there are branches of code that people are working on. And so when you work with teams like this, one of the things you're going to want to look at is, can I see your use cases, and can I take a look at, without modifying, without touching, can I take a look at the code? Can I see how people have been checking things in, checking them out? Not that you care about the code itself. You're not a coder. You don't know how to look at that. But you want to see the progression of people doing their work and the progress, and see where things are bogging down. The project manager should also be looking at this. But the project manager should not be going in, especially in an Agile environment, and interfering. Instead, the project manager talks to the Scrum Master, and the Scrum Master makes sure that everybody keeps off of and doesn't interfere with and doesn't distract or sidetrack the developers from their 2-week sprint. Now, with data-oriented systems development, like we talked about before, we access the data. The customer wants something to access the data, typically in a database. So we want to be able to view and manipulate the data. We want to be able to edit the data, add data, run reports, track trends, look at analysis models of the data, as opposed to object-oriented, where we have objects, which basically the data is contained in a way that you just don't directly access it. You access it through the methods or the functions, or these procedures. So I have here an object, which could be an instance of a class, and then I have the data in it and a procedure to access it, this method or this functionality. Object-oriented development can be used in all kinds of development methods, including waterfall SDLC, including iterative, which is basically just rapid application, or a spiral where we do one little thing and then we add a little more and we add a little more, we add a little more, or agile or prototyping. Obviously, you're going to want to use computer-aided tools as much as possible, especially when testing. Testing should be planned for way in the design phase of your whole project. And so we'll want to use tools not only to test, and obvious example is I'll use a tool, I'll run the code, and it'll pop up and show me where the syntax is wrong, and where something has broken, where something isn't working. And so I'll want to use automated tools to create and test software as much as I can. And here is but one example of a computer-aided software engineering tool. There are many. So when we're talking about projects, there are plenty of risks to the success of a project. At the design level, the C-level people, CEO, CIO, CTO, COO, they're not supportive. I have definitely been in projects where the CIO, everyone says, oh, it's one of his pet projects. It's his pet project, but he's got 100 pet projects. And so he's only got so much time and energy for each of his pet projects. Maybe the scope of the project wasn't actually wide enough. Maybe the system that we have can't support the project. Maybe it's incapable. Maybe you're writing software that requires that we trash all the servers and all the workstations and buy brand new ones. It's got to be 64-bit, or it's got to be, have 16 gigs of RAM, or a quad-core CPU, or a very frequent one. The organization itself is afraid of the change it's going to introduce. I mean, culture is a big thing, and culture is set at the top. Trying to change culture from the bottom up is like so difficult, but it is so easy if someone at the very top says, no, folks, let's do this. And, this is a good thing. This is what we should be doing. It will it'll change the culture so much quicker than trying to change it from the bottom up. There's risks to implementation. Maybe the sponsorship changes. They pulled the money, or they added money, or they're not satisfied, so they're not going to give you any more money. Or it's taking too long to implement this thing, or we're getting slowed down in the release, or the time frames are unrealistic. So often, unrealistic time frames. The client is thinking very optimistically. They're looking at the cheapest, quickest way, and you have to set expectation up front. And you have to involve them. If you can't, then involve them constantly so they can see for themselves how long something actually takes, or how much it actually costs. And then the risk in the operations, in the rollout. We didn't train people. If you're not going to train people, why are you rolling something out? If they're not going to adopt it or know how to adopt it. There was a time when major software vendors, there was one in particular, one probably the biggest, had said, part of any rollout, 30% of the budget should be training. And so maybe we didn't train people adequately. Maybe management didn't communicate to people, hey, this is what's going to happen, and didn't manage people's expectations and help them ease into using this. Maybe managers or employees, they sabotaged simply by not cooperating because they felt it threatened their job, or they too much work, or it just was something they just couldn't adapt to. And that's really management's job to help them prepare and move forward. Or there just wasn't enough testing of the release. So when you're looking at all of this, you want to make sure that you're managing within the project. You don't want to fail to identify the right resources. You don't want to mishandle the schedule or the costs. You don't want to fail your communication with suppliers and vendors, which will then jeopardize what they send you when they send it. You don't want to fail to give the key stakeholders the information they need, and you certainly don't want to fail to make sure that this thing actually works within the business's environment. Maybe the marketplace is changing. They don't need it anymore. Maybe the customers never really knew what they wanted, and what they ended up with isn't quite what they wanted, but they couldn't articulate it anyway. or they have the unrealistic timelines and changing requirements. And so that is what we need to bear in mind and look at when we're auditing how they managed a project and how they developed this system or this application.